So let's discuss some of the biggest myths around flint knapping and stone tools in general. So I've been flint knapping and working with stone tools in the bush for nearly 20 years now. The early phases of my stone tool usage really started out with using simple flakes and hand axes, really rudimentary tools that would kind of be organic to how early man used flakes and choppers and smashers. As I slowly progressed in my stone tool usage and flint knapping abilities, it was kind of that same progression with man. Mine was over a 20-year period. Theirs took thousands and even millions of years. And in this process, I've heard all sorts of myths. I've heard all sorts of, this is what you need to do to produce this sort of blade or this sort of flake, or, I mean, I've heard it all. I'm gonna go over some of those myths, really debunk them and tell you why they're just the dumbest things I've ever heard of. Now, I know we have all heard of the bird point. The myth is that bird points, like this one you see here sitting on top of this dime, were used to hunt birds. I can tell you from years of experience, based on hunting with stone points, making countless tools, that early man did not hunt birds with bird points. You can take large game with a point this size, meaning that this small little cutting tool, when hafted on an arrow, could take down deer. Ideally, a bigger stone point is going to do more damage. It's going to create a bigger wound cavity. But even this small flake right here will create a wound cavity. It will cause a bleed out, and ultimately that animal is going to perish. Why we think people hunted birds with these is because they're small. Because the point is small does not mean that they were taking small game with this. If I was to shoot this small point at a bird, and let's say something the size of a grouse or a dove, I'm going to completely obliterate it. Any arrow that's traveling at 200-300 feet per second with any sort of small little razor blade on it, and it makes impact with the bird, it's going to completely cause major catastrophic woundage, and that bird might not be 100% totally consumable. Yes, you could pick through it and pull out chunks of meat and use some of the feathers. I mean, anything's possible. But you really don't want to make an impact on that bird, especially for those small birds. What you're looking to do is create some form of blunt force trauma by a dull tip, even gluing a rock to it, taking the nub of a bone, putting that on an arrow, shooting it at the bird, and creating that crushing effect. When you're hunting small birds, and I'm not talking about turkey or even geese or even something like a crane. The theory is that people were using these for small birds. Again, you don't need it for a small bird. You could just need to crush the bones. You need to break a wing. You need to impact that animal where you're not going to completely obliterate it. What I do believe this point was also used for, this small style of point, was for poisons. It makes sense if I'm trying to introduce a poison on a projectile and get it into that animal's bloodstream, that all I need to use is a small projectile. I just need to make contact with the flesh, some veins, something to that extent, where I can introduce that poison into the bloodstream. Poison on this arrow point and down that shaft and introduce it into the bloodstream. I'm actually going to put more of the poison along the arrow shaft, allowing my small point to make the hole, introducing the blood into the muscles, into the veins, into the bloodstream, ultimately killing that animal. Wouldn't use this style of arrow or arrow point for introducing poison. I run the risk of hitting bone. Bottom line, bird points weren't used for small little birds. They were used for hunting game, just like any style of point. As long as it creates a wound cavity, forces the animal to bleed, you'll ultimately get the meal at the end. My personal theory, poison. Arrowheads, spearheads were made by heating rocks and then dropping water on them, getting them to fracture, creating these elaborate shapes that we see today in the archaeological record and from knappers today. A stone projectile point is made through the continuous process of reduction. It is a sustained effort through the chipping, through the abrasion, through the pressure flaking. The whole entire process requires somebody to pressure flake, to knap, to do a variety of things to produce that arrow point, that spearhead. The knapper will work on a raw piece of material, reducing it down, producing flakes, creating bifaces to ultimately get to that end state of an arrow. Arrowheads, spearheads are through the continuous percussion, utilizing hard hammerstones and different sizes of soft billets to produce flakes. It is a reduction process. It has nothing to do with heating rocks and dropping water on them. Now, this doesn't mean that ancient peoples did not build fires next to big slabs of rocks, heat them up and throw water on them to get them to fracture and produce smaller spalls or smaller pieces of stone to work with. This is actually documented in the UK in a place called Hand Axe Hill, where there's large chunks of flint sitting up in these rock faces, and people would build fires underneath, throw water on it. Big chunks of flint would fall out, and then they could spall them from there. In order to produce any number style of points and even axes, drills, adzes, you name it, it requires a skilled napper to reduce a large piece of stone down into some sort of bifacial form, working it into that final shape, producing that arrow point or spearhead. Myth number 3, stone tools are fragile. I would definitely say this is a myth. Stone arrow points, stone knives, polished axes, and even big bifaces like this. They are rugged, they are tough. It is stone. Stone can be fragile. Something like obsidian that is actually a glass is very fragile, but through the pressure flaking, through the knapping process, you can produce very ruggedized, very sturdy, and long-lasting tools that will stand the test of time. You can see that many of the stone points that collectors and archaeologists and people come across, they do have some wear and tear, but they're still there. They're there from thousands, 10,000s, even a million years ago. Now, if I was to take a piece of stone and drop it on the hard cement, could it break? There is that chance, but I can tell you I've done this. I've been knapping hundreds of points, hundreds of spearheads and axes, and have dropped them on the ground and nothing happens. Where they can gain some wear and tear is through the usage process. If I shot this at an animal and I hit a rib, I could get some edge flaking, I could get some edge damage, but I can simply and quickly just pressure flake around it, giving it a new working edge, and get this arrow point back in action. If I was to take this obsidian spearhead and smash it on some hard concrete, yeah, it's very likely to break because this, again, is glass. I take this style of point and I drop it on the ground. Could it break? There is that possibility. The most likely things that will break are the tips and the ears for any of that hafting. These are just thinner pieces of stone, and they are gonna break when they come in contact with something hard. But if I shoot this into an animal, yes, I could get a little damage. If I throw this up against a rock, it's very likely to shatter. They are tough and they do have a great deal of resistance. Stone points and blades and atlatl dart points are made specifically to last. Are they super fragile? No. If smashed up against another rock or a piece of concrete, can it break? Absolutely. If I shoot it into an animal, could I get some edge damage? Yes, but it's a quick fix. It's not the end of the world. You get that arrow back into action. Myth number 4, and this is one of my favorites. I know I'm going to break a lot of hearts out there, especially for some of the modern nappers that are always, producing stuff with modern tools. But ancient peoples did not use a jig or any special device to produce this flute. I've spoken with several archaeologists, and there is nothing in the archaeological record that suggests that some sort of lever jig or anything to that extent was used to produce this fluting. I know people are going to disagree, and I know a lot of modern nappers use crazy lever jigs, and they use these different push down jigs, and they build those jigs with all the modern tools. But ancient peoples, specifically the Clovis culture, would simply hold the spearhead. They would use a form of indirect percussion, where they would take the end of a billet, a piece of antler, they'd put it up against their platform, they'd hit it with another one, producing that flute. Every flute that I have created on every Clovis point, I've held in my hand, I've created my platform, and I've struck it with a billet, resulting in the flute. People will disagree, and that's fine. I'll just be the first one to tell you you're 100% wrong. There's nothing that has been found, recovered, or even collected that suggests that there's been some sort of lever bar, there has been some sort of, jig that we use to produce the flute in a Clovis point. 5, FLINT and CHERT are the same thing. Completely wrong. I have contact with a couple geologists, one geologist in particular. Her name is Elllie. She goes by Elllie Knows Rocks. She is a phenomenal geologist. She's been on several TV shows. She has dedicated her life to rocks, and I've reached out to her several times. And when it comes to understanding the dynamics of stone, she is my POC. I'm just not making this stuff up. Simplest thing is FLINT is a type of CHERT. And the differences between the two comes down to the microcrystalline form of CHERT and FLINT. More importantly, where those two pieces of material, the FLINT and the CHERT, form in that deposition. And essentially, that will make jasper, chalcedony, quartz the same exact material. Literally, the only difference between them is where those microcrystals form and their closeness to one another. So if they're super close, if they're super far away, that's creating the differences in the stone, not to forget about where they're actually formed in that deposition. So, you know, when people use the term CHERT or they use FLINT, in my opinion, what I've come across is Black English flint. You know, that flint that you typically find in the UK, in my opinion, is that purest form of true flint. But there are all sorts of different CHERTs and different materials that you could come across here in the States. I pretty much quantify anything that I come across in the States as a CHERT. That's just me being a napper and kind of saying, all right, what is true flint, what is Black English flint, and what is a CHERT? Again, flint and CHERT, they are different, and it really boils down to those crystals in that rock, more importantly, where they're formed. Myth number 6, crescent blades were used for hunting. Now, could you put this on an arrow, shoot it, and you know, ultimately kill something with it? Yes. You could take any weird stone flake, put it on the tip of an arrow. If it's got a razor sharp edge, you could do some damage leading to a bleed out. Do I think these were specifically used, hafted in this capacity, and then shot at an animal trying to hope to, you know, slice its neck and create some sort of weird kind of wound cavity sort of thing? No. Blades like this were used for game processing. You can take this guy and really start breaking down an animal, cutting through the sinew, looping underneath the sinew and being able to pull it out, pull it towards you to cut it if you have to. These are processing tools. These are for game processing in every simple way. People say they find these near the edges of streams and rivers, and they find them next to waterways, which would lead people to believe that they were shooting them at, you know, waterfowl, if you will. I think it's very unlikely that this was hafted and shot, but it's very unlikely ancient peoples would use these for any sort of projectile. They could be symbolic, representing the moon. They were very likely, based on my usage and some of the archaeologists and folks that I have talked with, that they were used simply for game processing. All right, myth number 7. This is the dumbest one I've ever heard of. Again, baffles the mind. Myth number 7, knapping underwater or the stone covered in water will produce better flakes in that initial phase of reduction. I'm not making this up. People believe, generally, they believe that if you hold this under maybe some shallow water in a stream and then you hit it with the stone, you're going to produce better flakes. There is nothing in the archaeological record. There is nothing that I have seen in any way, shape, or form where people are holding rocks underwater or just getting them wet and driving flakes off of it. If you think the amount of water, if this stone is wet, is going to have anything to do with popping off a flake, my mind's blown. I don't understand how that sort of conclusion could be drawn, because a wet stone, that water is not going to create any sort of special density. It's not going to create any sort of universal, you know, tamping around it. It's not going to create anything that's going to allow something to break off a piece of stone. It's not going to allow for anything special. It's not doing anything extra. It comes down to the napper. It comes down to the tools you're using, how you're hitting the stone, the type of stone, more importantly, overall ability to nap. If you can't produce the flakes, well, it takes practice. It takes time. It doesn't take some sort of weird concept or idea that by getting a stone wet or holding underneath some water is going to produce a better flake. Complete junk. That's out there. Can't even go off of that one. I really have nothing else to say about that. All right, myth number 8. This one's going to bother some people, but copper was used in flint knapping. Yes, copper was used, especially in the Neolithic age, around 8,000, 5,000 years ago, but it was used in the form of copper axes. This was a tool, it was a prized tool. Copper was a very precious metal. It took time to extract the copper ore and go through that entire smelting process and then cast it into various tools. It was very unlikely ancient peoples were taking something resembling a copper nail, putting it in a piece of wood or antler, and making stone tools and pressure flaking. Copper was a prized item. You know, we find copper axes and copper tools, but we don't find a lot of copper flint knapping tools. Yes, you could say copper and as it progressed into bronze and all these various forms by adding different materials, yes, it eventually replaced stone tools. But when you think of the Paleolithic times, when we think about the Mesolithic times, they were not using copper to pressure flake or to reduce large pieces of stone. It wasn't a thing. If you had a stone arrow point and you were a master craftsman, you were able to create all sorts of arrow points for hunting game, why would you take a piece of copper that was relatively new and start to try to shape it in arrow points when you still had millions and thousands of years of knowledge into crafting these? It doesn't make sense. But copper being one of the firsts, it was special. It was something that probably was held in high regard. It was used for some of those tools that would allow for a quicker result. Ancient peoples knew stone tools were still effective, especially during the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic time. They weren't using copper. They weren't using copper to pressure flake. They weren't using copper boppers. They were using stone. They were using antler billets. They were using antler tines and bones to craft all the same stone tools they had used for thousands and thousands of years. Billets and pressure flakers have worked for hundreds of thousands of years. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They could still produce these great works of art in stone through spearheads and drills and burns and all sorts of stuff. They were able to create all the tools they needed with simple billets and pressure flakers. I believe this is number 8, and this one's gonna hurt some archaeologists, but having done this probably more than archaeologists, atlatl foreshafts were used for butchering the game after the kill. I'm telling you right now, I have some archaeologist buddies and friends that are gonna be saying, no, it's totally true, it makes sense. Why not use the stone tool that's on the tip of your atlatl dart and start, processing out that game? And I would simply say, and they'll a couple different archaeologists I know will actually do that in some of the experiments that we've done. And in my mind, I would simply say that why would I use this tool? I mean, I have a bag of foreshafts here. Why would I use my foreshafts to start opening up game when I have hundreds, thousands, and even million years of creating stone tools, stone knives, various forms of blades to process out the animal? It wouldn't make sense. If you think that I would, let's say, take down a bison or take down a mammoth and start using the foreshaft I just killed that animal with, or even extra foreshafts that I have on hand, no. This is a hunting tool, and I would keep my hunting tools specific to the task they're designed for. I have the knowledge, right? Ancient peoples had the knowledge to work stone. They had the knowledge to craft all manner of tools for cutting, slicing, chopping. Why would I not use a tool specific to butchering out game? In my mind, it makes more sense to use an obsidian blade, a CHERT blade, flint blade, whatever, to really start butchering out that animal. If I have the knowledge and if I have the skills and the abilities to create stone blades, choppers, and knives, I would use those because that tool is specifically designed to cut, to process, to open up game. I would use the tool that I had made to do that task, which is butchering out the animal. I wouldn't use my atlatl foreshafts because this is a different tool. It makes sense for me to continue using this tool by putting an atlatl and ultimately throwing it. It wouldn't make sense, especially when you have primitive peoples that aren't really primitive, they're far advanced, especially in their lithics. If they have the ability to make an array of cutting tools and slicing tools, and they just killed a bison, they just killed a bison antiquus, they just killed some sort of large megafauna, why would I use my atlatl foreshaft? It doesn't register in my brain as a process. Now, this is based on my own experiences. Thrown many of atlatl and bison and hogs and various animals, I'm not gonna pull that thing out and start opening up the game. It's probably embedded in there, it's probably stuck in a bone, it could be broken. I'm gonna use a knife that I would carry with me, or a handful of flakes that I'm removing off some sort of blade core, or that I'm moving off of some sort of biface, and I'm going to use those flakes. I want to use a razor blade. I want to use something extremely sharp to get into that animal, especially in that butchering process. I think it's a popular theory, and I've seen, I've seen it firsthand, in some of the bison experiments that I've done and some of the hog experience. Folks like to pull out, a FORESHAFT and start cutting. This would be a specialized tool. I would take my FORESHAFTs, set them off the side, say these are for killing, and something like this is for butchering. Tools are designed for the tasks. It just makes sense in the general application of butchering out an animal. I know that one probably hurt some feelings. Myth number 9, women and children never learned how to flint knap. Yes, and I'm not saying because of this day and age, but you have to think logically in your head. If there was an ancient peoples in stone tools, the production of arrow points and blades and choppers and all these various things, all these things were used on a daily basis. And to think that a woman or a child were not capable or were not allowed to process and make those tools is completely absurd. An entire culture that has been based on stone tools for hundreds and thousands and millions of years would absolutely, without a doubt, know how to produce arrow points, know how to produce spearheads, cutting tools, drills. In my mind, it is completely just erroneous to think that women, or even children, depending on the age obviously, don't know how to produce a quick blade or a quick flake, or to even go into some intricacies and actually create some specific spear points or arrow points. If you're in a group, let's say you're in a tribe, a clan, a group, a cohort of people, let's say 15 to 20 people. Yes, people might have had specialized skills, but when it comes to the common stuff, the very, very common stuff, producing a flake to, process game, producing some sort of worked and reinforced cutting edge to, cut fibers, or to do any number of tasks, was probably very, very common amongst all the people. In there could have been specialized things, like there could have been some amazing basket makers and hide tanners and weapons fabricators. Yes, there could have been specialized, departments, if you will, or specialized tasks, but it is very likely that most people, if not all people, in that clan, in that tribe, in that cohort of individuals, all of them knew some form of flint knapping to produce tools. Most logical answer typically is the right answer. That's what I'm going off of here. All right, so those are some of the more common myths. If anybody knows any more, let me know. I'll definitely do the research into the stone tools and some of the flint knapping stuff. I find it interesting. It's something I've been doing for quite some time now, and through actual experimentation and living remotely and hunting game and making all sorts and manner of tool, I can pretty much shed some light on some truths and inaccuracies when it comes to, this topic. I think the most important thing is, before I end this, don't believe everything you hear when it comes to, flint knapping or stone tools. Get out, more importantly, experiment with some of these things. I challenge everyone to go out there and do your own research. When you hear some of these crazy myths about stone tools and flint knapping, see what you can dig up. I'd love to hear about it. You can leave it in the comments below. So that's pretty much it. If you're one of those, novice flint knappers and you're trying to hold a piece of stone underneath water to produce a better flake, don't waste your time. Just start breaking rock. Before you know it, you'll get there. All right, appreciate you watching.